All right, hopefully you had some success with this exercise. One quick thing that I want to mention here is that the intent was that you should be making multiple console log statement calls. So we are not assembling one string and then escaping it with like a new line character at the end. We are making multiple strings and console logging each of them. When I say multiple strings, I mean one string for each kind of set of steps here, or each level to the staircase. So if you saw some error message saying, hey, expected you to call stairs more often or something like that, that's probably why you were seeing the message. Make sure you are logging each independent level. Okay, so in this section, we're going to go through one possible solution. I think that this is definitely the easier to come up with solution that we're going to go through first. After we look at this solution, we'll then take a look at an alternate way of solving this by using a little bit of recursion. I think that the recursion solution here is ultimately maybe a little bit easier to come up with and put together. However, it does require you to kind of use your recursion skills to think of, which is definitely quite challenging. So anyways, we'll do the iterative solution first and then take a look at the recursive solution. So let's look at a diagram that's going to help us understand this iterative solution. So the first thing to recognize here is that we are kind of dealing with a matrix of sorts, or kind of like a 2D array. We're not really working with arrays here. We're always working with strings. That's what we are assembling. But it's helpful to just kind of think of it in terms of like indices. It's going to make it a lot easier to come up with the actual solution. So here's the idea. First, we want to recognize that we're going to have some number of rows that we want to iterate through. So this would be row 1 right here, and then row 2 and row 3. And then we are also kind of going to want to iterate through some number of columns. So column 1, column 2, and column 3. I came up with a nomenclature saying that we will reflect the current row that we are iterating through with a variable that we're going to call I, and then the current column with a variable that we're going to call J. One very easy way to make your solution look much more straightforward, and you know what, I think that we'll probably end up doing this. Rather than calling these I and J, because that's kind of tough to remember, let's call this like row and column. That makes life a little bit easier. I think that's going to be a little bit better. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at exactly how we're going to do this. First, we're going to write a for loop. The first for loop that we're going to write is going to iterate through all the different rows that we have. We're going to iterate from 0 to n, and we'll call this, we'll say specifically iterate through rows. Then for each row that we are considering, so let's imagine this particular row right here, we are going to start off by creating an empty string that we'll call stair. Now stair is meant to be singular, like just stair by itself, to indicate that this is one individual row that we're looking at. Then we're going to iterate from 0 to n again. In this case, this second for loop right here is meant to iterate through all of our different columns. So from left over to right. Then inside this inner loop, we'll say if the current column that we are looking at is equal to or less than the current row, we want to add a pound. So this is kind of like the big jump in logic right here. This is the kind of tough part, is this if statement. So I want you to look very carefully at this thing. Right here, we have column 0, then column 1, column 2. Let's add a little bit of numbers on here just to make that a little bit easier. Let's do a copy. So we'll say C0, meaning column 0. I'll put that right here. And then we'll put row 0 right there. And then I'll just do two others with this nomenclature. We'll put R1 right here. We'll put still C0 right here because we're still in column 0. And then just one more, we'll put row 0 over here and C1 right here. So whenever you start working on these problems where you are kind of iterating through two sets of rows and columns, especially, honestly I wanted to use more generic terms, but anytime you start thinking in terms of row and column, you want to start seeing if you can see a pattern of any sort here. And so if I start thinking about a pattern between which of these squares or which of these characters are supposed to have a pound and which are supposed to have a space, the first thing that I start to notice is that we want to have a pound if C has a value that is equal to or less than R. And we can see that in very quick action here. So C is equal to R, so we get a pound. In this case, C is less than R, so we get a pound. But over here, C is greater, I said pound, excuse me. C is greater than R, rho, so we get a space instead. And that's the pattern that we're following all throughout this thing. So even when we start going down to the very bottom right corner down here, so down here we would be working with column 2 and row 2 right here. So still we are less than or equal to the row count. So we're still going to get a pound down here. So that's basically the row that we're going, or the rule, excuse me, that we're going to use. If we do not meet this if statement right here, then rather than adding a pound, we must be on this kind of upper right-hand triangular section up here, in which case we want to add a space rather than a pound. And the last kind of key to the problem here is that after running through this for loop, where we iterate through all the different columns, we will take that stair, or that kind of row representation of this one line that we have, and we will console log it. Then when we go through the next iteration, or move on to the next row, we're going to redeclare that stair variable as a new empty string. So that's pretty much the solution. Again, this is just one possible solution. There's definitely more than one way of doing this, but I think that this is a relatively straightforward way of doing it. So let's take a quick break right now. We'll continue in the next section, and we'll put together the implementation for this solution.